I am Professor Helen Rose Ebaugh from the Department of Sociology here at the University of Houston. I teach primarily the sociology of world religions. And what I want to talk with you today about is the concept of organizational culture. We often think about culture in terms of groups, small groups, large groups, medium-sized groups, or we talk about culture in terms of symbolic expressions via the media, in terms of values and norms of a group. There's another way in which we can think about culture, and that is from the perspective of organizations. Every organization, small, medium, large, has an organizational culture. And on the board you will see a definition for organizational culture. Organizational culture is the specific collection of values and norms that are shared by people and groups in an organization and that control the way they interact with each other and with stakeholders outside the organization. So that is what we mean by organizational culture. Today I want to demonstrate organizational culture by telling you about a study that I have recently completed and that I report in my new book. It's called the Gulen Movement, a sociological analysis of a civic movement rooted in moderate Islam. It's a movement that began in Turkey in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Today it is a global movement with activities in schools in over 180 countries, in 5 continents around the world. And I want to begin by telling you how I got interested in this movement. On September 11th, 2001, I was teaching my world religions course here at the university, and I taught at 8:30 in the morning. And my routine was to come in at 7:30 and spend an hour preparing my lecture. I began to lecture on the role of religion in conflict around the world, and that particular day I was lecturing on Northern Ireland. I no more than started my lecture, and one of the students said, "Dr. Ebaugh, what about the World Trade Center?" And I said, "Oh, you mean in 1992 when the first attack on the World Trade Center occurred?" He said, "No, this morning." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And about that time, a second student was on his cell phone and he said, "My girlfriend has said, turn on CNN." I thought at first the students were mistaken. I had no idea what they were talking about. But what I said to them was, if what you're telling me is in fact true, if there has been an attack on the World Trade Center in New York, the world will never be the same. And it doesn't matter what I say to you today. I said, and so we're going to go over to the UC and we're going to turn on CNN and watch these world-shattering events. And I still wasn't totally sure that this was in fact what was occurring. I said to them, but before we go, let me just make a prediction. I predict that in the next 10 minutes, someone will blame Muslims for this attack. And I said, it well may be an Islamic group, but let me just remind you that there are many, many sects or groups of Muslims, and they're not all the same. So let's don't paint all Muslims with an event like this. And with that, I dismissed class and we went over to the UC and saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. By the time we came back on Thursday to class, I had three covered Muslim women in class. All three of them and their families had been contacted by the FBI. My big question from the very beginning was, where is the moderate Islamic voice? This was the first time many people had heard of Islam. Hopefully those who had taken my world religion knew a little bit about Islam. But many Americans knew nothing about this, quote, strange religion. And they're introduced to Islam under these tragic circumstances. For the next several years, I kept waiting for the moderate voice. Now, on September 21st, about 10 days after the attack, I opened the Washington Post, and there was a full-page statement protesting 9/11 and saying this is not Islam. Islam is a peaceful religion. And it was signed by M. Fethullah Gulen, imam and scholar. And that name caught my attention. That's the first I had heard of Mr. Fethullah Gulen. In the several years after this event, I began to have graduate students from Turkey. Some of them who were attached to the Gulen movement, who were supporters of the movement. And several of them did theses of the movement here in Houston. So I began to get familiar with the movement. Now let me tell you a little bit about the movement. I then made my first of 7 trips to Turkey. And in 2008, I spent 2 weeks there doing systematic interviewing. And based on all of this data comes this book. It's the first general introduction to the movement for a Western audience. And the book has just done phenomenally well, especially in Turkey. It's a controversial movement, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In the late 1960s, Mr. Fethullah Gulen, who was an imam in Turkey, began preaching on the street corners, in some of the coffee shops, anywhere people would listen in Turkey. And his message was that the youth must be educated, that the future of Turkey and the future of the Middle East lay in educating the young people. And he went on to say, not in madrasas, these Islamic schools that we've heard so much about, but in public and private schools, and the youth must be instructed in science and mathematics and technology. And along with this, in what he kept calling human values. Now, this was not such a terribly radical idea, except he went on to say, and to do education like this is to be a good Muslim. To be a Muslim is to be educated and to value education. And he said there's no conflict between Islam and modernization. Over a period of several years, many people around Izmir, where he was preaching, resonated with his ideas. It was a time in Turkey of great illiteracy. It was a time when a lot of movements were coming into Turkey, communism, Maoism, a lot of nationalist movements. The youth were in great turmoil. And increasingly, more and more of them became very interested in Mr. Gulen's ideas. Simultaneously, Izmir is an industrial center in Turkey. So some of the local businessmen became interested in supporting these educational endeavors. And Mr. Gulen preached, everybody has a role. He argued, we need principals, we need good teachers, we need families who will support this kind of education, and we need finances. We need businessmen who will put their money behind these endeavors. At the time, there were no private schools in Turkey. All the schools were public. So immediately, what Mr. Gulen suggested to his supporters is that they build dormitories where rural kids could come into the cities, live in these dormitories where parents thought they would be safe, and go to high school and then university in the big cities. And these dormitories became very, very popular and very successful. Simultaneously, university students would come into the dormitories and tutor the students. Along with that, Turkey has a universal university exam. Everybody in high school has to take the university exam, and one must make a certain score before you can go on to university. So we also started these preparatory courses where students were prepared for the university exam, and they were very successful. His schools were able to raise the rate of acceptance into universities significantly. So the movement became very popular in Turkey. More and more people were interested in this kind of educational endeavor of the movement. And of course, along with this came the practice of Islam, because Mr. Gulen himself was very much a practicer of Islam, and many people attracted to the movement were practicing Muslims. So over and over again, Mr. Gulen taught there is no conflict between science, education, and religion. Rather, they go hand in glove. In the 1980s, President Özal became president of Turkey. And one of the things he did was allow private schools. He also opened up Turkey to the business community. He made Turkey more global, and this middle-class entrepreneurs grew during the 1980s. Many of them were very attracted to these ideas of education. And in the late 80s and early 1990s, the businessmen began putting their money into private schools. These private schools, they're now, we don't know for sure, but probably around 500 in Turkey. They follow the state curriculum. They emphasize science. They have beautiful science labs and computer labs. The students in these schools compete internationally in competitions and win many prizes. So they're very much private schools, but following state educational curriculum. These schools became very popular, and increasingly Mr. Gulen encouraged young people to go to schools of education, to become principals and teachers, which they did. And the schools are very successful. There are now over 1,000 of them around the world. And the educational level of the students in these schools is very high. Now, the big question is, how are these schools supported? Where does the money come from? And when I began studying the movement in the mid-2000s, that was the big question. There were some people who were saying, where does the money come from? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is it Iran? Is it the American CIA? Where's the money? So when I did my study in the spring of 2008, that was my big question, to try to get to the financial structure of the movement. And now here is where I get into these notions of organizational culture. I did 103 interviews at all levels in Turkish society, starting with the most wealthy entrepreneur supporters of the movement, continuing with professional lawyers and doctors, all the way down to blue-collar workers. And to summarize, what I found basically is that everybody supports the movement. Somewhere between 5 and 20% of his or her annual income, with the average being about 10%. Now, whether you're making $1 million a year or whether you're making $10,000 a year, across the social spectrum, people were giving about 10% of their income. In addition to this, many people were giving volunteer labor, hours of volunteer work. These students that I had, as you know, we work our grad students long hours, but they were spending 20, 25, 30 hours a week doing volunteer work in the movement. So the question is, why? What is providing the motivation for this kind of commitment? And also, people in the movement are highly committed to what the movement is doing. There are two answers to this. One of the reasons is that Turkey has always been known for a culture of hospitality. Going back to Muhammad and his desert culture, he emphasized helping those in need, taking care of one's neighbor. It's said that Muhammad hardly ever dined by himself in his tent. He would open up his tent to needy people who were hungry. So if one goes to Turkey, you're immediately struck by the hospitality of the country. Even the travel books will say that. It's one of the key characteristics of Turkish culture. Now, along with that comes the notions of Islam. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is zakat, Z-A-K-A-T, which means the obligation to give a certain portion of one's income to the needy. Now, what I found among these people in the movement, zakat equals maybe 2.5% of one's income, certainly not 10%. In addition to zakat comes notions of doing more than just the minimum. And there are many Islamic ideas. Also, for a lot of people, one helps one's neighbor with the expectation that your reward will come in the hereafter. That's how you please Allah, by helping your neighbor. So now to the idea of culture. This is precisely the organizational culture of the movement, rooted in Turkish hospitality and these Islamic notions of giving and helping one's neighbor. This culture permeates the supporters in the movement. We don't know exactly how many people in Turkey and around the world are followers of the movement because there's no bureaucracy. It's totally a network organization. There are no records, there are no membership rolls. We don't know how many, but we can estimate, and the best estimates are that in Turkey, this may amount to 7 or 8 million people. And if you multiply 10% of income, and many people in the movement are quite wealthy. There are these rising middle-class entrepreneurs in Turkey. It's not unusual for some people to give 100,000, 500,000, even $1 million in some instances to activities in the movement. So when you multiply that times 7 or 8 million people, that's quite a sum of money. So I concluded my interviews convinced that the movement is not being supported by any government. It's being supported by members of the movement themselves through this organizational culture of giving and helping one's neighbor. Now, let me say a little bit about what happened in the 80s and into the early 1990s. Mr. Gulen began to realize that globalization is what's happening in the world. And he began to emphasize the need for dialogue, intercultural and interfaith dialogue. So this is the second big organizational cultural value in the movement. Education, and on the other hand, dialogue. And Mr. Gulen himself met with the Pope. He met with the Patriarch, the Greek Patriarch, some of the major leaders of religious groups in the world, and he began emphasizing this need for intercultural, interfaith dialogue. One of the things the movement does around the world is interfaith trips, where it takes people to Turkey and introduces them to different cultural and religious groups. Also, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, Mr. Gulen began saying, up to this point, our activities are restricted to Turkey, schools and so forth. He said, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's now a vacuum among the youth in these former Soviet countries. So it's time to begin building schools in these Central Asian countries. So in 1992, a wealthy businessman in Istanbul sold what he had, bought an old school bus, packed his family in this bus, and headed to Azerbaijan. And today there are about 10 schools throughout Azerbaijan. I visited them about a year and a half ago. Shortly thereafter, these schools began to increase to Turkmenistan and all the Central Asian countries. Today there's schools, I visited Melbourne, Australia, Brussels, Paris, London. Last summer I was in Spain. There are no schools in Spain, but there are members of the movement. Africa, the schools are exploding in Africa. And again, it's driven primarily by the Turkish diaspora, who have these organizational values of hospitality and helping one's neighbor. My current project is looking at the movement as it has spread globally. And it's one of the leading global religious movements in the world. I was at the Parliament of World Religions in Melbourne, Australia, 2 years ago. And there were 2 religious leaders invited to the Parliament as exemplars of global peace. One was the Dalai Lama, the other was Fethullah Gulen. So Mr. Gulen is fast becoming a major figure in global peace around the world. So one of the big areas right now in sociology and in Sociology of Religion, which is my specialty, is global religion and how globalization is impacting religion and religion is impacting globalization. So I'm in process of putting together an edited book with a colleague, Stephen Cherry, at U of H Clear Lake. And we're studying 10 global service movements around the world. And then along with this, I'm also tracing this Gulen movement as it spreads through the Turkish diaspora around the world, looking at issues like what kind of adaptations does the movement make? What kind of international ties are maintained by members in the movement? And one of the things that has struck me very much as I move around the world in this project is this notion of organizational culture. I'm trying to describe it. I said at a meeting in Amsterdam a year ago, you can tell a Gulen person when you encounter one. I was in Azerbaijan and we had a rather stressful week. When the Gulen person walked in the hotel to pick me up, I knew immediately that he was my contact. There's something about supporters of the movement that exude this organizational culture. It's hard to describe, but it's there. It's there in the clothes they wear, it's there in how they talk, it's there in their values and the kind of norms they have. In the late 1990s, the Gulen movement was brought to the United States, primarily by graduate students who came to the United States to get graduate educations. And it's growing very rapidly in the United States. There is a big dialogue society in Chicago, in Washington, in New York, on the West Coast, and here in Houston. In Houston, the Dialogue Society is called the Institute for Interfaith Dialogue, and it's located in the southwestern part of Houston at a place called the Turquoise Center. And in fact, next week, the middle of October, the Turquoise Center is initiating a big peace garden. It's a quite large piece of property that contains a Christian church, a Jewish synagogue, and an Islamic mosque, and it will be dedicated by many of the major religious leaders in Houston. Also, at the University of Houston, we have the Gulen Institute, which was established about 3 years ago. It's a partnership between the Institute of Interfaith Dialogue and the University of Houston. It's located in the School of Social Work. And the purpose of the Institute is to provide a space for scholars and for researchers to meet together to facilitate studies of peace and tolerance and dialogue. The Institute also sponsors luncheons, usually down at the Hyatt Regency, and there may be 500 people that come from the business community and the educational institutions downtown, and there's a major speaker. For example, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has been a speaker. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, has been a speaker. Last year, we had Vicente Fox, the former President of Mexico. And it's through these luncheons that the Gulen Institute is becoming very well known in Houston. In fact, it's one of the 2 outstanding interfaith organizations in Houston, along with the Houston Interfaith Ministries, the Gulen Institute, and the Institute of Interfaith Dialogue are bringing together people of all kinds of cultures and faith communities in Houston, and is gaining quite a reputation for its contributions to Houston. Thank you.